Before we start ZBrush, let's set up the graphics tablet a little bit. I have a Wacom tablet. You may have different procedures, but we all have to configure these keys on the stylus. They should be configured as the right mouse button and the middle mouse button. I'll call them accordingly from now on. So the first thing you'll see when you start ZBrush is the standard interface. And here you see a built-in browser called Lightbox. Here you can find project presets, brushes, textures, and so on. For now, we don't need it. You can turn it on and off with this button or using the comma shortcut. If this is your first time opening ZBrush, you might be confused by the slightly strange layout. By default, ZBrush opens in 2.5D mode. To show this, I'll select Simple Brush in the Tools panel. I can draw on the canvas as in Photoshop. The only thing that differs it from Photoshop is that in addition to the color information, the pixel stores depth and material information. For example, I can remove the influence on depth in this panel and leave only the influence on material and color. If I change the material, I'll just draw on the same shape. So now I'll be changing the material. I mean, it's not a 3D object, it's a 2D canvas. I can't rotate it. All I can do is zoom the canvas itself and move it. And for example, if I select some cylinder and start adding it, I can add it in different materials. All these cylinders, right after I created them, they are no longer 3D objects. They are pixels on the screen that have depth information. This mode is absolutely useless for sculpting. All we need to know is how to clear this canvas of these random objects. To do that, we just have to press Ctrl-N shortcut. If you want to resize the canvas to its normal size, you just have to click Actual. Another common problem is that the size of the canvas is slightly smaller than the window. If you want to change this, go to the Document tab, make sure that Auto Fit Window Size button is on, and click New Document. This is also where you can adjust the background color. I just prefer to remove the gradient because I don't like it. Now to start sculpting. I'll select a 3D object and draw it on the canvas. In order to make it vertical, I'll press the Shift key and right after you created it, it's very important not to click anywhere on the canvas and go straight into Edit mode. You can use the T shortcut. Now you can rotate the camera around the object. This is the Edit mode where we're going to sculpt. You can control the camera with these buttons. Move, zoom, and rotate the camera. You can also rotate the camera by clicking the second mouse button anywhere on the screen. So you can also rotate the camera on an object. If you want to move it, press Alt and click the second mouse button, and if you want to zoom, press Alt and click the second mouse button. And then release Alt while holding the second mouse button. Sometimes when navigating in the viewport, the object can go somewhere outside the window, and in order to get it back in place, use the shortcut F. Note that we're now in the Draw mode. This means that we can sculpt. Let's choose some kind of brush. You can choose a brush right here. Here we see a huge list of brushes, and this menu can also be accessed with the shortcut B. It's very difficult to choose brushes from such a huge list. I want to find the Move brush. When I'm in this menu, I can press M and the list is limited to brushes with names that begin with the letter M. I can find the Move brush here. In this corner, you can see the shortcut for this brush. It means that in order to select the Move brush, I need to press BMV. In this way, we can select any brush. Now I want to change the radius of the brush. For that, you can use this slider here. Also note that when you hover the mouse over any interface element, you'll see shortcuts for those elements. So in this case, you can press the S key while in the viewport and change the brush radius. If you try to use the Move tool now, you'll see a message like this. This means that the cylinder is a standard primitive element and we need to turn it into a regular mesh. To do this, click on the Make Poly Mesh 3D button and now we can start sculpting. The Move brush is one of the most useful brushes in ZBrush. It's most handy for changing the large shapes of an object. When you work with any brush, if you keep the Shift key pressed, the brush automatically changes to the Smooth brush. It simply makes the mesh smoother. And these two brushes are enough for the blocking phase. But I'll tell you about the others during the lesson. There are a lot of weird concepts in ZBrush, and in particular, it's worth mentioning how to save projects properly. Let's say you've sculpted a character and you want to save it. The first thing that comes to mind is to go to the Document menu and click Save As. If you try to save a document, ZBrush will ask you specifically if you want to save the document instead of the active tool. The problem is that if you save the document, you'll get a 2.5D canvas, which means that it'll just be an image made up of pixels with depth and material information. And the 3D object itself won't be saved. And that's why you need to keep the active Z tool. You may have noticed that you have several different tools in this area. Now this tool is active. You can switch between them. It's easier to think of them as separate scenes with 3D objects. I mostly work with just one Z tool, and in order to save it, you have to make sure it's active and then just click Save As. After that, you'll see the standard menu, where you can rename it and save it in the desired folder. After that, you can load the Z tool into the project in the same way. Now we have two identical Z tools. Another way to save documents is, for example, if you have a lot of different subtools accumulated here and you want to save them all, such as the location of the camera, documents, and so on, the simplest way to do this is to go to the File menu and click Save As. Then you'll save the entire project. Let's open a new blank project and start working on the character. We're going to work on the reference, and ZBrush has a very handy system to work with references. First, let's load our reference into ZBrush. In order to do that, we go to the Texture menu, click on this empty field, and import the reference. Then the picture should appear in the list of textures. Select it and click on the Add to Spotlight button. You should see the navigation ring and the image itself. If you click in the center of the circle, you can move the navigation ring. I'll place it in the center of the image. If you want to move this image, just hold the stylus in the center of the ring. If you want to scale, click on this icon and rotate the ring. Also, you can use opacity. I'll reduce the opacity a bit to see the 3D model through the reference. If you want to exit the Spotlight editing mode, I recommend to use the shortcut Z. If you want to turn off the display of the reference, use the shortcut Shift-Z. And in a similar way, you can turn it on. Later, you can always return to the edit mode using the shortcut Z. Now let's select a cylinder and place it on the canvas. When the cylinder is created, don't forget that you don't have to click on the canvas and immediately go to edit mode. Now it's a 3D object and we can rotate the camera. In order to be able to sculpt, turn it into Poly Mesh 3D, and since we have Spotlight enabled, we need to do one more thing. We need to turn off the Spotlight effect on the 3D model. So go to the Brush Samples tab and turn off Spotlight projection. The advantage of Spotlight is that your image is always on top of the sculpt and you can adjust the shape of the sculpt to the image. You already know that you can sculpt in draw mode, but sometimes we need to move and rotate an object. For that, you can press the W shortcut to select the transformation tools. Actually, move, scale, and rotate are the same tool. So I choose move because its shortcut is next to the draw shortcut. Here you can see the gizmo which allows you to rotate, scale, and move the object. You can also change the position of the gizmo in relation to the object. Therefore, just press and hold Alt and place the gizmo in the desired position and orientation. Now you can transform the object relative to the new center of rotation. I'll undo all changes, and now let's rotate the object to 90 degrees. To rotate in 5-degree increments, just press and hold Shift. I want to use this cylinder to create the chest of the character. And for this, we're going to use the transformation tools and the move brush. Shortcut BMV. Now we have a little problem. If I increase the radius of the brush to the maximum, I don't have enough of that radius to rule large shapes. In order to fix this, I just select the transformation tool again and shrink the object a bit. Most of the time, characters are symmetrical, and it would be more convenient if all the changes on the right side were repeated on the left side as well. For this, ZBrush has a symmetry mode. Go to the Transform tab and click on Activate Symmetry, or use the shortcut X. The main thing is to make sure that you haven't shifted the cylinder relative to the center of coordinates before. Now you can use the gizmo to fit the cylinder to the proportions. You can also use the reference and fit the model to it. Now I'll choose Move Brush. First, I'll press Shift and smooth out the model a bit. I use the Move Brush to adjust the shape. At this stage, it's important to remember that we're working with large shapes now. So I use a very large radius of the brush. Keep in mind that when you keep the Shift key pressed, the brush settings change in the upper panel. This is because the smooth brush has its own settings. For example, I can change the intensity of the smooth brush by keeping Shift pressed to make the smoothing softer. It's worth mentioning that when you use a flat reference like this, it's best to work in an orthogonal projection. Right now I have an orthogonal camera projection by default. And if you want to change that, you can click the Perspective Distortion button or use the shortcut P. If you want to change the focal length of a camera, go to the Draw menu, and here you can find the focal length options. At this time, I'll work in the orthogonal projection. Currently, the symmetry works in relation to the center of the coordinates, and we need to make sure that the object is in the center. You can turn on Floor, and then the mesh and coordinate axis appear in the viewport. So I see that everything is fine, and now we can continue sculpting. Right now, Z-Tool contains one 3D object, but it can contain several subtools. Go to the Subtool tab, and here you'll see a list of all the subtools. If you want to add another subtool, click the Append button. A list will appear, and you can select any tool or primitive. Now I'm going to select a sphere. The sphere appears in the list, but notice that the old subtool is active. So we need to activate the sphere to start editing it. Let's make a shock of hair out of the sphere to immediately indicate the dimensions of the character. For this purpose, use the shortcut W to turn on the transformation tool. Fit the camera to the reference and fit the sphere to the shock of hair. Now let's add another subtool. This time I'm going to select the cylinder. I'll select it and I want to make a head of it. I use the transformation tool to scale it up a bit and move it to a place where we have the head. I use the shortcut Z to edit the transparency of the reference. Next, I want to make a foot. For this, I'll just select the cylinder and duplicate the subtool. Then I'll select the new subtool and position it in place of the foot. Pay attention that the old subtool exists now, but it isn't visible in the viewport. Just click on the eye icon. I'll position the foot a bit more, and now we need to reflect the foot to the right side. So to do that, go to the Geometry tab, then Modify Topology and click Mirror and Weld. Different subtools may have different symmetry, and when we created the new subtool, we had the symmetry turned off. So press the shortcut X to activate the symmetry. And now you can adjust the shape of the feet a little bit. First, I'll just smooth out these cylinders and use the move brush to give an approximate shape to the feet. At the initial stage, you shouldn't concentrate on the details, but imagine that they're just plasticine balls. At first, you'll just dial in the overall mass and define the overall proportions of the character. I keep working with the same tools, which are the Transform tool, as well as the Move brush and Smooth brush. I use a large brush radius, so I don't have to go into details. At this point, I want to talk about another very important tool in ZBrush. I'm going to slightly reduce the radius of the brush. If you keep Ctrl pressed and draw on the object, you'll mask out some of the polygons. These polygons have become darker. This means that if I use the Move tool now, it'll only affect the unmasked polygons. This works with absolutely all brushes, and also with the Transformation tool. If you want to invert the mask, keep Ctrl pressed and click on an empty area of the screen. Also, keep Ctrl pressed, and if you click on the geometry itself, the mask boundary will be blurred. You can click several times to blur it more. If you want to clear the selection, then keep Ctrl pressed or Command on the Mac, and swipe over the blank area of the screen. Also, if you keep Ctrl pressed and start drawing a mask from an empty area of the screen, you can select polygons using the rectangular selection. You can find the same functions in the masking panel and some others. For example, you can invert the mask, clear it, blur it, make it larger or smaller, or make the mask boundary clearer. In this case, we need the mask to flatten a foot. For that purpose, keep Ctrl pressed and drag the stylus from the blank area of the screen and select the bottom part of the foot. While keeping Ctrl pressed, click on the canvas to invert it. Select the Transform tool, press in the Alt key and position it around here, and now you can scrape the unmasked area. You might have noticed that when you keep Ctrl pressed, the brush changes. If you click on the brush icon, you can select other selection methods. As an example, I can click Mask Lasso and select in this way. If you press Alt, you'll subtract the mask. Now let's add legs. And to do that, I'll add another cylinder, select it, and scale it up. Almost every ZBrush tool has a lot of hidden functions. When you use Transform, for example, you can scale on perpendicular axis. Currently, I want to fit the leg to a reference. I'll adjust the thickness of the cylinder to the top of the hip. Then I want to give the leg a slightly tapered shape. I'll use the Transform tool. In addition to Gizmo, the Transform tool has all sorts of hidden functions. So if you click on the gear, you'll see a list of a huge number of modifiers. Let's choose the Deformer Hard modifier. This tool is very similar to the FFD box in Cinema 4D or other 3D programs. I don't need this many points. In order to reduce the quantity of them, I use these little yellow cones over here. I just reduce them to a minimum value. The mask is also used to select the points. That is, I need to mask out the points that I don't want to change. And now I can use the gizmo to move, rotate, or scale the points. Well, let's compare with the reference and adjust the thickness. In order to return the normal gizmo, click on the gear icon and click Gizmo 3D. Next step, I want to reflect the leg. To do that, I'll open the Geometry tab, and in the Modify Topology tab, I click Mirror and Weld. Also, don't forget to press X to activate the symmetry. Previously, we switched between the subtools using this menu. But you can also select subtools simply by pressing Alt and clicking on them. This will help you quickly position objects and adjust their shape. I strongly suggest you avoid stopping at one part of the sculpt and switching between the different parts. It'll allow you to maintain the integrity of the perception of the model. Let's add a sphere for the pelvis. Last time we simply copied from Subtool, and sometimes it's handy to copy the geometry directly into the viewport. You can use the transformation tool for this. Just keep Ctrl pressed and move the object. Notice that the old object was masked, and both of these objects are in the same subtool now. If you want to split an object into two subtools, then we have a few ways. In this case, you can go to the Split panel. There are several options for splitting objects here. Split to parts is fine for us. ZBrush will just split the geometry into parts that aren't connected topologically. So we have two different subtools. If I highlight the pelvis, you may notice that the gizmo isn't in the center of the object. So to put it in the center, keep Alt pressed and click on this icon here. Then I'll adjust the shape of the pelvis to the reference. Don't forget to correct the rest of subtools as well. Use Alt-click to switch. I want to move the shock of hair back a little bit to reveal the face. Also, I correct its shape using Move. I'll use Smooth to flatten the head and correct the shape. Don't be afraid to correct what you've already done. The model always looks weird at first, sometimes ugly. Just keep working with the larger shapes. Try not to go deep into the details at the beginning, and as you gain experience, the models will get better and better. Here I use the mask to fit the top of the head. Now let's make the arms. In order to make them, I'll select the chest and copy the subtool. I'll turn off symmetry, because it's not needed here, and then I'll use the transform and move to correct the shape. Sometimes I move the gizmo by pressing the Alt key. Now I'm trying to position the shoulder so that I can get the thickness and shape that I want. But then again, it's not worth spending too much time. We just need to approximate the overall mass, and then we'll just correct it later on. Further, I'm going to slightly straighten the arm to make it easier to model the armpit and elbow area later. Then, keeping Control or Command pressed on the Mac, I'll copy the shoulder and make it into a forearm. The shoulder is automatically masked off. I'll adjust it to the reference to correct the shape, and after that, I'll move it away and extend the arm. Now I'll copy this piece again to make a brush volume out of it. Let's see what it looks like. I'll drop the mask selections, and I want to move the arm back a little bit. It'll give it a funkier look. Now let's copy and mirror the hand. In the Geometry tab, go to Modify Topology and find Mirror and Weld. For now, the arms consist of several parts, and all aren't contained in one subtool. Most brushes will affect all parts at the same time. If you want to keep all the objects in one subtool, we need to be able to edit these parts separately. We can try to use masking, but it doesn't help much because a mask also highlights all the objects. For this purpose, there is another very important concept in ZBrush, which is called polygroups. First, let's turn on the mesh display. You can click on this icon or use the shortcut Shift-F. Right now, the objects are the same color, because they have the same polygroup. If you want to use a polygroup, find the Polygroups menu in the toolbox. Here you can find the Auto Groups button. As you can see, it automatically splits all objects into different polygroups. If you are in transform mode, you can press Ctrl or Command on Mac and click on any object, and ZBrush will mask all objects except for it. Thus, we can only work with it now. Unfortunately, we can select only one polygroup this way. But what if I want to select several different polygroups? For example, in this case, I have different polygroups for the shoulders. I want to select two shoulders. Therefore, we have to go back to Draw or just select any brush, clear the mask, and then press Ctrl or Command Shift and click on any polygroup. ZBrush isolates the selected polygroup. If you want to invert visibility, press Ctrl or Command Shift and drag over an empty area of the canvas. Further, when one of the polygroups is hidden, if you click on another polygroup while pressing Ctrl or Command Shift, it'll be hidden too. Now we can invert the visibility of the polygroups again. We have two arms. So though we don't have to do the same thing every time, let's connect both arms into one polygroup. This can be done by pressing Ctrl or Command W. Now let's do the same thing with the forearms. Keep Ctrl and Command Shift pressed and click on one forearm. Then invert the visibility. Click on the second forearm, invert again, and press Ctrl W. If you want to make polygroups visible again, press Ctrl or Command Shift and click on an empty area of the screen. And I'll do the same thing with the brushes. It seems strange at first, but eventually you'll find that it's quite intuitive and handy. Also, if I choose the Move tool, while keeping Ctrl pressed, I can select objects of the same polygroup. And there is another way. I'll reset the mask in Draw mode, then keep Ctrl-Shift pressed to isolate one polygroup, invert the mask, return the display of all polygroups, and invert the mask again. It is also helpful to use polygroups to separate objects. For example, if I want to leave the shoulder and forearm in one subtool and send the wrists to another subtool, I press Ctrl or Command Shift and click on the wrists in the Subtool tab. Find Split and click on Split Hidden. So now I have two different subtools. If you're going to use the Move brush and you're too lazy to deal with polygroups, there's another way. There is a brush similar to the Move brush. It's called Move Topological, shortcut BMT. It'll only change the mesh that's topologically connected to the one you started sculpting. In other words, you can quickly adjust the individual pieces. Further, I'll continue fitting the arms to the body. Here I use the Move Topological brush. It's not necessary to fit everything exactly to the reference all the time. It's much more important to capture the overall proportions and temper. It's also much more useful to train your eye and sculpt by looking at the reference and then comparing. Here I fit not only the arms but also the chest, because everything is connected to everything. If you change or add something in one part, it greatly affects the perception of all other parts. If you look at other designers on YouTube, you may notice that they often zoom out of the camera to see the overall silhouette of the character. Once again, I want to draw your attention to the fact that I work with a large brush, and in fact I barely touch the mesh. The changes are quite small. I just see that I don't like something, and try to move it in different directions. For example, here I think that forearms are a little short. I try to move the hand back. If it looks better, I leave it like that. At this point, I think the legs are spread too wide. I keep Alt pressed to move the gizmo and move the legs a little to the center. Now the legs are close, so I'll spread them out a bit to the sides to leave some free space for sculpting the rollers. I think the rollers are a bit large now, so I'm shrinking them down. Now I want to turn them slightly as on the reference to compare the scales. All in all, it looks similar. I'll put them back in place because it's much handier to sculpt in this position. I'm also going to extend the feet a little more to have more space for the wheels. It's a little early for small details right now, but the wheels make a big difference to the silhouette. So let's add a subtool for the wheels. I'll create a cylinder. Remember to switch to the active subtool. And use the transformation tool to rotate and move the wheels to the right place. I'll reduce their size and try by eye to make them look proportionally the same as on the reference. I keep the Control key pressed and copy the wheel. Now they are both in the same subtool. I'll reset the mask selections and move them to the outside of the foot. Also, by pressing Ctrl or Command, I'll copy the wheels for the inside. I'll add another subtool. Select a cube to make a pendant from it. At first, as usual, I adjust the overall proportions, and then I'll mask the different areas, then move and scale them, using the transpose tool. Here I use the familiar Deformer Hard tool. I want to increase the radius of the wheels a little bit. For this, I enlarge the rear wheels, and now I need to remove the front wheels and copy the rear wheels again. You should press Ctrl or Command Shift to select polygons and isolate them, and then invert the polygon visibility in the Modify Topology tab and click Delete Hidden. The invisible polygons are removed and you can copy the rear wheels again. Let's copy the wheels to the right side. For this purpose, go to Geometry Modify Topology, click Mirror and Weld. The main thing isn't to forget about activating the symmetry of the shortcut X. Here I use masks and transpose to position the wheels. Afterwards, I'll speed up the video a bit and correct some more things. For example, the connections between the arms and the chest. I'll use only the familiar tools, which are Move, Smooth, and Transpose. Here I'll add a little bend to the forearms, and make the elbow articulation smoother. In order to do this, I'll use masking by polygroups. I want to add some biceps. Also, I think the shoulder is a little long, that's why I'll shorten it. I forgot to copy and mirror the suspension, so I'll use Mirror and Weld, and after that I activate the symmetry. The ears are also very influential on the silhouette. That's why let's add another cylinder. Highlight this subtool and make it an ear. Next, I want to edit the position of the reference in the spotlight. In order to do that, press the shortcut Z. Now you can scale the image and move it where you want. This way, it'll be much more convenient to adjust the ear. Press Z again to exit Spotlight editing mode. At the same time, I can adjust the head more accurately. I want to make it a little more cone-shaped. Also, I noticed that the legs in the reference are a bit thicker. In this case, I'll just use the move brush for now. After, I'll return the spotlight back into place. I remind you that this is the shortcut Z. And I'll correct the ear a little bit more. In the Geometry tab, I use Mirror and Weld to copy and reflect the ear. Don't forget to activate the symmetry, because I constantly forget to do it. I turned the ear slightly backwards. Thus, it will look more natural. The next thing I'm doing is fixing the hair and the head a bit more. At this point, the general personality of the character has begun to emerge, and we can proceed to the finer details. But this doesn't mean that we don't have to think about proportions. After adding the detail, your perception of the model will change, and we'll want to change something. I often change the proportions even after the resurfacing stage.